Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks. And 3 weeks ago, Wargaming taunted us during the developers' diaries of the new Tier 10 Czechoslovakian heavy tank, the VZ55. Now, until now, we had pretty much no statistics about this tank, apart from knowing that it's going to have the option of a 2-round autoloader and also just a regular 130mm caliber gun that could fire in a cyclic fashion. Today, finally, we have some statistics of this tank so we can get an idea of whether it's going to be worth grinding towards, and that's what I'm going to do today. Let you know whether you should jump into the game and uncheck accelerated crew training in your Skoda T25 so you can get prepared if the VZ55 is going to be that tank that you want. Alright, so in true Wargaming fashion, they gave us an image of the VZ55 up here, and they gave us all of the statistics. And of course, in true QuickyBaby fashion, I've decided to lift these off into an Excel document so that I can compare the vehicle in the B column, firing cyclically without the autoloader. In the C column, with the 2-round 130mm caliber autoloader, and then the D column, I'm going to be comparing the two versions of the VZ55 to the Rinoceronte as well. So immediately we notice that not all calibers of gun are equal. The 130 on the VZ55 and also the Rinoceronte with its 127mm caliber gun have all got 490 alpha damage, meaning that this tank is going to pack a punch with or without an autoloader, just like the Rinoceronte does. Now, firstly, let me clarify that this is an autoloader, not an auto reloader. So don't think that you can reload the shells one by one. You have to fire both, or you have to reload both at the same time. So with regards to penetration, 260 on the standard rounds, decent. 306 on the premium rounds, those are APCR. That's rather disappointing, actually, compared to the Rinoceronte's 325 high explosive anti-tank. That's going to struggle to be able to get through the front of an E100 or a Mouse, or even when you're just firing at decent distances against that annoying Soviet heavy tank that just wants to sit there hull down. High explosive rounds on this vehicle with 68mm of penetration, again, aren't anything really to write home about. I could imagine loading 2 HE rounds in the autoloader on this vehicle and then unleashing them is going to be a little bit brutal. Interestingly enough, something that I didn't put in Excel is the ammo capacity. This thing carries 40 rounds. That is a ton of ammunition, meaning that you should be able to take enough AP for when you're in your nice matchups against tier 8s and tier 9s, APCR when you're having to deal with more tier 10 tanks, and also you're going to be able to take a good chunk of high explosive rounds. If you can pen those HE rounds, by the way, you're doing 640 damage, meaning that this might be one of the best tanks in the game for going after artillery. Alright, so if you decide to use the autoloader on this tank, and firstly, Wargaming, I'd like to say it's really cool that you're giving us the option of 2 competitive guns on this tank, just like with vehicles like the E100. I think it's great that there's that kind of customization there so that people can play tanks for their own play style. And while I guess it's more work for you to try and balance out 2 different loadouts on this tank, a massive thumbs up for me for giving us extra variety inside the game. And also having to try and quickly gauge whether the enemy tank will have an autoloader or not is going to be a tricky thing to do. Alright, so clip capacity on the autoloader is 2, and this is what is amazing about this tank for me. 2.5 seconds intra-clip reload with 490 alpha damage. That just means that this thing is going to be able to burst far quicker than the Rinoceronte has been able to, with its 4-second intra-clip reload. Now, when we think about it, the T57 Heavy has a 2-second intra-clip reload. I believe the AMX-50B has a 2.5, and the Kranvang is at 2.75. So that means that this vehicle is going to have the same intra-clip reload as an AMX-50B, a better intra-clip reload than the Kranvang, but also still packs a bigger punch. That is a scary intra-clip reload for a tank that hits so hard. Being able to burst out 980 damage within 2.5 seconds of the first shot, and then being able to have a fairly short magazine reload after that of just 25 seconds gives this vehicle an impressive damage per minute. Not nearly as good as something like the Kranvang, however, which is packing 2,933 DPM, and when we think about it, the Kranvang's reload time of 21.5 to reload 3 120mm rounds that's able to do 1,320 damage might seem more impressive. And so really with the VZ35, it's all going to come down to just how effective you can make that 2-round burst. One thing's for certain, however, with the rate of fire, with the effective rate of fire on this tank, when you're using the autoloader being 4.36 rounds a minute, that's way better than the Rinoceronte. Even if you don't use the autoloading capacity in the Rinoceronte, its effective reload is only 3.82, and that's if you're only firing when you're fully loaded. Everybody knows that with the Italian auto reloaders, as you go deeper into the magazine, the damage per minute gets worse, meaning the Rinoceronte will dip down to an abysmal 1,470 damage per minute until you fully reload the tank up. To have the effective DPM of the VZ55 with the autoloader at 2,138 is decent enough itself, but what's really cool about this tank is if you don't like the sound of that autoloader and you don't like having the faff of having to think through your mags and instead you'd rather just play this vehicle in a classic fashion, there is the option to get rid of the autoloader and to just have a single cyclical gun. And if you do that, your rate of fire will increase to 4.8 rounds a minute, meaning that your damage per minute now goes up to 2,352. Now, that's still a little bit low compared to a vehicle like the T110E5, but maybe this vehicle is going to have a decent armor profile. Anyway, interesting decision here. Do you want to use the autoloader and effectively lose half a round an extra minute, or do you want to give all of that up and just be able to fire one by one to have that extra flexibility? So now onto the gun handling of this tank. It has really bad accuracy at the moment of 0.4. That's definitely not going to allow you to snipe at decent distances, unlike something like a TVP T50/51, the tier 10 Czechoslovakian medium tank that this vehicle is going to have to compete with. The aiming time is 2.8 seconds if you're not using the autoloader, and 3.1 if you are, so the aiming time gets a little bit worse if you're using that autoloader. But as we know, that doesn't really mean anything if the vehicle's gun handling is also not good, because you might look at the Rinoceronte and think the Rinoceronte has the best aiming time ever and the gun handling looks incredible on the Rinoceronte, but then you figure out that it's got awful dispersion when you're moving and awful dispersion when you're turning the turret, and unless you literally pimp out every cruise skill on the vehicle and double stack equipment like vertical stabilizers and a rotation device, the Rinoceronte's gun handling just feels awful. Maybe Wargaming will give the VZ55 good gun handling to make up for that poor aim time. Maybe they won't. We're just going to have to wait and see, as that's one of the statistics that Wargaming do not provide for us. Depression-wise on this tank, it's 8 degrees. It's pretty good. Not great like the Rinoceronte, but that should still make this thing fairly flexible on a ridgeline. The turret traverse is a standard 25, elevation is standard 15, not too much to talk about there. The mobility on this vehicle, however, seems to be very impressive. An 850 horsepower engine combined with the weight of just shy of 55 tons gives this thing of an impressive power to weight ratio of 15.5. That should make this a faster heavy, not ludicrously fast, and we don't know the ground resistances as well at the moment, so we're going to have to wait to see what those are going to be and how they combine with the raw horsepower of the tank. But that's pretty much identical to the Rinoceronte. However, this is one thing I'm loving the look of with this vehicle, and that is the top speed. 50 forwards and 15 backwards. That should make this thing very fast indeed. It kind of blurs the lines between a heavy tank and a medium tank. In fact, this thing's going to have very similar mobility to something like a 121, for example. And that's always a scary thing if the vehicle does have armor, which we're just going to find out about now. So unfortunately for the tank, the hull armor is not really very good. 115 at the front of the hull doesn't look like that is going to hold up against many shells. Although it is very well angled, so maybe it's going to get auto ricochet if it's using some of its gun depression, or if it over angles the side of the tank. However, the side armor is pretty good on this vehicle at 90mm, meaning that you probably could over-angle this vehicle, especially against lower tier tanks. That should be fairly formidable, and against higher tier tanks, well, I guess you're going to be able to side scrape, but it remains to be seen what these kind of side plates will be like here when you do turn the tank, as to whether they are going to become weak points. Alright, so far not too good with regards to the armor, but this is where this tank certainly changes. Look at this turret. 300 at the front and 150 at the side. And while it looks like it's going to have weak points on top, I'm really interested to see how this spaced armor over the side also protects you from high explosive rounds. Maybe there's going to be some weaknesses around the gun mantlet. That's something we will only find out when we have an armor model for the vehicle, but all in all, that is looking like a very solid turret. And when you combine that with 8 degrees of gun depression, that gives you the flexibility to rock a ridgeline. And it definitely makes the turret of the latest tier 10 auto-loading heavy tank in the game, the Rinoceronte, look absolutely awful. Although you could argue that the weak point on top of the Rinoceronte is probably going to be a lot smaller than this classic Commander's Cupola on top of the vehicle. So, rear armor wise, 90. Don't want to really get shot in the back too much if you can avoid it. That should still protect you from high explosive rounds. Thank goodness there's no real weakness of this vehicle here to those kind of ammunition from the sky, right? Hit points wise, 2,100. Better than the Rinoceronte, still not anything super special. Less than the T110E5, and certainly this thing is not going to be a super heavy kind of tank. And the view range, 390, fairly lackluster, but not awful, meaning that unless you have a really good crew and you use a premium consumable, your view range isn't going to be very good. And so some players are going to want to have to use coated optics on this tank. Personally for me though, I'd definitely be wanting to use vertical stabilizers, a gun rammer, and vents on a vehicle like this. And so all in all, so far, I'd say that the VZ55 looks like a bit of a mixed bag. It doesn't really look like it's that scary in all honesty. When I look at something like a Kranvang with 2,933 damage per minute, the fact that the vehicle reloads 3 rounds in less time than it's going to take the VZ55 to reload 2 rounds with the autoloader really starts to set off alarm bells in my head. Also, the fact that the Kranvang will have that bigger magazine potential of 1,320, but you've got to also argue that the Kranvang will take 5.5 seconds to be able to deliver it, whereas the VZ55 with its 2.5 second intra-clip reload will be able to pull off a mega punch. That is 980 damage within 2.5 seconds. I don't know about you, but I don't want to get shot by them. The interesting thing, however, is that if this vehicle is going to be outrageous, then surely the Kranvang should be outrageous, because the vehicles have fairly similar statistics. And the Kranvang has that god tier turret. The Kranvang also has, I'd say, the enhanced mobility with a better power to weight, better forward speed, better reverse speed. The Kranvang's gun handling is decent enough, and I'd be very surprised if the VZ55 has as good or better gun handling than the Kranvang does. Combine that with worse gun depression and worse aim time than the Kranvang, and I really start to worry about the VZ55 as to whether it's going to be a competitive vehicle. See, the Kranvang at the moment is just packing a win ratio just over 50, meaning the vehicle is definitely good, but not crazy good. Whereas the other autoloading heavy that went into the game recently, the Rinoceronte, is packing a win ratio of 49.5, which is incredibly low for a new tank that went into the game. So, as this vehicle is currently on super test and characteristics are not final, I would kind of expect this vehicle to probably receive a little bit of love in certain areas before it reaches the game. But then again, I said the same thing about the Rinoceronte, and here we are with probably one of the weakest new entries of any vehicle inside World of Tanks. But maybe that's more healthy for the game. Do we really want to have faster tanks with god tier turrets, with also having the kind of gun performance that they need to be able to cut through the entirety of the enemy team? Well, probably not, unless all you really want to do is just play the new tank over and over and over again. You don't want to play anything else because you'll have to meet them and they'll be absolutely kicking your backside. And while we certainly don't want that, and I'd rather vehicles went into the game balanced, they also have to be exciting when they're new and they're for a new nation's type, such as the VZ55, and I feel like Wargaming missed out a little bit on opportunities for the Rinoceronte to make it a true exciting vehicle that you didn't feel as if you were kind of putting yourself at a disadvantage just by signing up in it. And when I take a look at the statistics of the Kranvang, and I just see it being better pretty much across the board, I really worry for the VZ55, and I question whether it's going to be worth investing the time getting, if you could just get the Swedish Heavy right now. Anyway, ladies and gents, that was it for my first look at the statistics of the VZ55. I have to admit, after seeing them, it's not a disaster. I'm definitely a little less excited about the Czechoslovakian heavies. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Let me know in the comments what you think about the initial statistics of the VZ55. Do you think that it looks absolutely incredible, or do you think it just looks a little bit average and a little bit mediocre, especially compared to some of the more dominant auto-loading heavies in the game? And as always, have a wonderful Friday, whatever you choose to get up to. Have a good weekend, and hopefully I'll see you soon.